Good afternoon and welcome everybody to our webinar on collaborating to prevent massive nitrous oxide waste in medical gas systems. This is a Pacific Northwest regional webinar taking place on May 2nd of 2023. Next slide. A few housekeeping items we'd love for you to pay attention to before we really get underway. First, we made the strategic choice, despite our large group of over 300 registrants, of making this a meeting, not a webinar. So you have the ability to come off of mute, and we want you to be aware of that. We'd love for you to remain on mute unless you really intend to speak to the whole group. So we also are going to be using the Q&A function today primarily instead of chat for addressing questions to any of our presenters. You can, of course, still use chat for any kind of informal comments, especially for messaging individuals. Reserve it for those purposes. But please use the Q&A function when addressing questions regarding the content of the material. We will be providing you all with these slides that we're using, as well as the webinar recording access. You may want to take a moment now in the spirit of engaging with the group by adding your organization to your name. If you're not familiar how to do that in Zoom, it's pretty straightforward. You have to click on the participants list on the bottom bar, and then hover over your name and look for those three little dots to the right of your name. You can click on that and then select rename, and then you can type in your organization following your name. If you wouldn't mind doing that now, that would be great. Next slide, please. So we want to tell you what brings this topic to all of you today, because it's kind of a fun and interesting story. For most of us, it started with, or most of us organizers, it started with being aware of, if not directly viewing, the CleanMed conference presentation done by Dr. Brian Cheeseborough and Andy Mason in last year's conference, in which they really surprised some of us, me included, regarding the discovery that they're going to be telling you about again today, as well as the research that they performed once they made a particular discovery, the assessment that they conducted, and the solutions that they came up with initially at Providence St. Vincent, Medical Center in Portland. So many of us were very inspired by that presentation, that discovery, the solutions, as an opportunity for us to, without any great effort and no additional cost and possibly savings, be able to reduce what we think of in sustainability world as scope 1 emissions, the emissions over which we have direct control in our operations within our facilities. So we're going to hear about that. We were inspired by that. We wanted to duplicate their work that they described in some of our own facilities. And those of us who do sustainability work inside healthcare in the Pacific Northwest started talking about how to go about that and helping each other through that process. We, for many years, have held roundtable meetings among this group of growing friends of fellow healthcare sustainability managers or coordinators or directors. And the interest was so high in this topic that we talked about expanding from just essentially a call among a dozen or so people to bringing it to the attention of as many people as we could reach within very specific job types that are going to be central to conducting this work and completing what you're going to learn about within as many hospitals as we could reach. So we felt like we had the ability to go deep as well as broad, and possibly carry it on in duration by having follow-up that you're going to hear about today as well. Our group expanded over time into a number of doctors, a number of facility managers, as well as the core group of the initial sustainability folks. And as a group, we came up with this vision that across the region, we wanted to transform the delivery method of nitrous oxide within hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers to radically reduce leaks and resulting greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And this is that group. We have been kind of preparing for this moment for quite a while as we talked about how to get across to a variety of people throughout the states of Oregon and Washington and the province of British Columbia. So this is our group that we only a week ago decided to start calling ourselves the Cascadia Nitrous Oxide Collaborative. And we are the organizing group that brings you this content today. Next slide. And here's what we came up with. About to complete my introduction. I am John Lee. I'm the Pacific Northwest Sustainability Director at Common Spirit Health. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Cheeseborough and Andy at length, essentially a slightly shorter version of that Clean Med presentation that I mentioned earlier. We'll have time for an extensive Q&A with Dr. Cheeseborough and Mr. Mason. We'll be splitting it up with polling questions here and there to engage with you and get a little information out of you, the audience. And then we'll have rapid fire hospital case studies of about 5 minutes each. And we're going to hear from Dr. Stuart Brown at Vancouver General Hospital in British Columbia, Dr. Wynne Strokebeck at Virginia Mason Medical Center in Seattle, from Brian Nelson at Peace Health Southwest Medical Center in Vancouver, Washington, and then from Seattle Children's Hospital, Dr. Liz Hansen, and then hear from Adam Lowe, who's going to talk about your opportunities for post-webinar implementation assistance, and hopefully some discussion period at the end with our remaining time. Next slide. So here we go with our first of a few polling questions. We thought we could kick this off by learning from you what you know about the principal type of nitrous oxide medical gas system your organization uses. Please answer this poll in the next 30 seconds or so, if you would.
John, we have a lot of responses coming in. We've got about 80 plus at this point. If you want to give it another 10, maybe?
Yeah, 10 seconds left. Okay, let's call it. So what we're seeing for, I think you're seeing the results now, that many of you believe that central supply rooms with pressurized tanks, as well as e-cylinders, are your primary type of nitrous oxide medical gas system. Very good. Let's stop sharing and move on, Hillary. So now up we have Andy and Brian. So I'd like you guys to go ahead and add anything to my introduction of you and take it away.
Thanks, John. And I just want to thank at the outset you specifically for bringing this group together and doing so much work to keep us all herded together and moving forward in the direction. None of this would happen without you. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yes.
So I'm Brian Cheeseborough. I'm an anesthesiologist at Providence, Portland, primarily. And I'm also fortunate to serve as the medical director for environmental stewardship for Providence Health. I'll go ahead and introduce Andy. He's going to show up later. He's a facility director at Providence St. Vincent Medical Center, also in Portland, which you will see features prominently in our story. Next slide, please. So just to kind of orient everybody about nitrous oxide and why it's used in our hospitals and ASCs. Clinically, most common use is as an adjunct to general anesthesia. It's used outside the OR for sedation and analgesia. Some facilities use nitrous oxide as a cryo-ablative refrigerant, either for cardiac ablations or gastrointestinal ablations. I've even seen it used, not in Oregon or the Northwest, but I've seen reports of it used as the primary gas for abdominal insufflation during surgery, which was a little bit astounding to me to see that. Clinically, the most common side effect is nausea and vomiting. There's some enzymatic inhibition that creates neuropathies, bone marrow suppression. And there are issues with occupational exposure. OSHA has a workplace exposure threshold of 25 parts per million. The risk with longer term exposures are spontaneous abortion. Obviously, if you're in a room that's not where the gas isn't being actively scavenged, you also run the risk of acute intoxication. Next slide, please. And here, so clinically, we have a sense of what it's used for. I did want to kind of ground us a bit in terms of some of its physical properties in comparison to the more potent inhaled anesthetics, which you see more on the left-hand side of the slide. Nitrous, in terms of clinical potency, that percent number, a higher percent means weaker clinical potency. So you can see that it's a very weak as an anesthetic. That's why it's really only used as an adjunct to general anesthesia. And in terms of emissions intensity, that number 265, that's the global warming potential. What that number is telling us is that for every kilogram of nitrous oxide, that is the greenhouse gas emissions equivalent of 265 kilograms of carbon dioxide. All these greenhouse gases, once emitted into the atmosphere, they have differing atmospheric lifetimes. Nitrous oxide persists in the atmosphere for 114 years. So the nitrous that we use today, or we will use tomorrow, will outlive all of us without question, our children and likely many of our grandchildren. Next slide, please. And these medical gases, and by that I mean the potent inhaled anesthetics and nitrous oxide, they matter. The medical gases can contribute up to 40% of a given hospital's direct scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions. Here in this figure, every bar, we're looking at a different hospital in the Providence Health System, where we're looking at the percent contribution of these direct emissions. So nitrous, inhaled anesthesia, and then the one that's most common and most commonly thought of are the emissions generated from the burning of natural gas on site. You can see there's a lot of variability amongst these hospitals, ranging between barely visible to up to 40%. So the point here really is that there's the potential for it to be a major contributor to your scope 1 emissions burden, but you have to look for it, you have to measure it, you have to be proactive and figure it out for yourselves. Next slide, please. And we've been interested in these scope 1 anesthesia related emissions for a while. In the Providence, Oregon region, we started a clinical quality improvement project in 2017, looking at the emissions associated with those potent inhaled anesthetics and nitrous. And we were encouraging our clinicians to change their practice to use lower carbon alternatives as appropriate. And with the inhaled anesthetics, we saw a dramatic decrease in the use of the more potent forms of anesthesia and an associated drop in greenhouse gas emissions. Here in the figure on the left, we're looking at the clinical use as measured in time spent using nitrous oxide in the hospital. And you can see year over year there in Oregon, there's been a steady decrease in the clinical use of nitrous oxide, which makes sense given that that's what we were encouraging our clinicians to do. So between 2016 and 2020, we saw a 61% reduction in the clinical use of nitrous oxide. However, when you look at in the figure on the right, you look at the overall emissions, there's really no change. They're essentially the same. So it prompted us to scratch our heads and to say, well, how can we have a 61% reduction in the clinical use and have no impact on the overall emissions? Prompted us to think, well, maybe there's something else going on, and clinical nitrous oxide is not the primary driver of emissions. Next slide, please. So we turned our attention to assessing the overall system efficiency, and we really sought two sources of data. One is the supply data, which we asked our medical gas vendors to provide for us. You can see that an example table there on the left, where we're quantifying, well, how much nitrous are we bringing into the hospital every year, hooking up to the system, and then we're comparing that with the clinical use data, which now with an upgrade to our anesthesia machine fleet, we are now able to measure every liter administered to a patient in our operating rooms. Next slide, please. So when you compare those, when you bring that together, you can see that these facility nitrous oxide leaks are very common. So these bars, again, every bar is an individual Providence hospital. Across the x-axis, we have annual metric tons of nitrous oxide related greenhouse gas emissions. The blue section of the bar, those are the emissions attributed to the leak or preclinical losses. The little gray tips on each of those bars, those are the nitrous oxide related emissions that are directly attributable to the clinical care. So you can see it's a widespread issue. It's not a one-off. It's not just Providence, St. Vincent. It's all of our hospitals. We've done this for all 51 hospitals in Providence. We've helped other hospitals do a similar sort of assessment. The lowest or the greatest efficiency hospital that we've ever encountered still loses or wastes 67% of what they bring into the hospital. It never makes it to a patient. So given this widespread preclinical losses, we wanted to do a deeper dive into understanding what all the components of that system and where in the system there's potential for loss. At this point, I'll ask to advance to the next slide and kick it over to Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So when Dr. Cheeseborough brought this issue to my attention, I was gobsmacked because we had never really considered how much nitrous was being clinically delivered. We just simply made sure that we had adequate supply in the tank room. So we began evaluating our medical gas system, the supply, the delivery system, and looking at how it was handled at the end by the med gas vendor. And we found that there are potential losses at every stage of the process. We'll get into how supply tank design can have a profound effect on the amount of preclinical losses that you see. Delivery systems, every stage of the delivery system, from the manifold that the tanks connect to the wall port, to even the anesthesia machine itself, can have minuscule leaks that in a large system can add up to large volume leaks. Just simply the way the equipment is used can produce inefficient delivery. And then there is, with central supply systems, there is an unavoidable loss of residual volume when that tank is returned for refilling at the vendor. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. Next slide, please. So at St. Vincent, when this work began, our system consisted of a pair of nitrous oxide cryogenic liquid tanks connected it to our manifold on the primary and backup, or primary and secondary sides. And then we had a block of high pressure cylinders acting as a backup, which is a standard NFPA cryogenic system. Based on our purchase data, you can see the graph on the left-hand side. The pink or kind of orange section represents what we were bringing in from the supplier. And that's based strictly on purchase data. The bottom green section is what was being delivered to our patients based on data taken directly from the electronic medical records. So we could be pretty confident in the volume of that delivery. In looking at our cryogenic tanks, we realized that that was a significant part of our issue. And this was actually a major learning event for me. I did not realize how lossy cryogenic tanks could be until this was brought to my attention. Just for those of you who aren't super familiar with med gas supply or cryogenic tanks, a cryo tank is basically a giant thermos bottle, 600-pound thermos bottle. They're about 5 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter. It's a double wall vessel with an outer jacket and an inner jacket where the inside which the supercooled fluid is kept. In the case of nitrous oxide, it's kept at about -88°C. And you can see on the diagram there, the top of the tank is just kind of a forest of valves. There's a couple that are important that I want to call out. Your gas use valve, that's what you actually connect to your manifold to send the product out to the facility. It's not just sipping evaporated gas off the top of the tank. It actually is pulling liquid from the bottom of the tank, and it's connected to a pipe that's soldered to the inside of the outside jacket of the tank. And as that gas or that liquid flows through that tube, it's vaporized by exchanging its heat with or absorbing heat from the surrounding room. And then it leaves the tank as a gas. Another important one to notice is the pressure building valve. If you can imagine, the gas use valve is drawing liquid out of that tank, and the volume of the distance between the top of the tank and the top of the liquid is increasing as that level drops. That's going to create a vacuum. So you use the pressure building valve to draw a small amount of liquid off of the liquid end of the tank. It vaporizes it and introduces it to the top of the tank. And that produces a pressure inside the tank that allows the product to be pushed out of the gas use vaporizer and out the gas use valve. If that valve is incorrectly applied, like it's opened when the tank is not in use, or when the level is not dropping quickly enough that you need to reintroduce that much excess gas to the top, you can actually overpressurize your tank and open the relief valve and release product. Because that gas is coming out at a very cold temperature, well below freezing, in certain atmospheric conditions, it's possible for that to build ice on that relief valve, and it can actually freeze open and just ventilate the entire contents of your tank. Dr. Cheeseborough did catch that actually happening in one of our hospitals during this work. Regarding the relief valve, as I mentioned, these tanks are basically a giant thermos bottle. It's -88°C at the product in a room that's about 20°C. There's no way to keep that heat completely away from that product. So it's always going to be vaporizing a little bit, sitting in a warm tank room. That causes the pressure to build inside the tank, and a small amount is expected to be released out of the relief valve over time. And in fact, the rule of thumb, it's called the normal evaporation rate. And it's expected that between 0.8 and 3% of the volume of a full tank will leak every day. And so the approximate rule of thumb is you take a full nitrous oxide tank, a cryogenic tank, and set it in the corner as a spare. You're going to hook it up to your system when the current tank gets empty. After 30 days, that tank is half gone, just sitting there in the room. So if you can imagine, we had 2 nitrous oxide tanks sitting there connected to our manifold, one connected primary, the other is just sitting there as a secondary waiting to be used. You can see the amount of clinical use we had really was minuscule compared to the potential volume of these tanks. And so one of those tanks was just sitting there all the time, venting basically. And so we thought, smoking gun, this is where we're losing all of this nitrous oxide. So next slide, please. So we made a small investment and converted our central supply to pressurized tanks. And the cool thing about nitrous oxide is when you pressurize it to above 650 PSI approximately, it condenses to a liquid at room temperature. So these tanks are not actually full of gas. They're mostly, when they're full, they're mostly full of liquid nitrous oxide. The cool thing about that is, I don't know if anyone's ever had the opportunity to try and move a full nitrous oxide tank. They weigh a lot. They actually hold about twice as much volume compared to, say, a nitrogen tank, a tank that, or a gas that we typically see in high pressure applications. So that allows you to actually get a lot of bang for your buck with these pressurized systems on a central supply. And there are a couple of caveats. The first is that because this is condensing to a liquid and it basically is held at 650 PSI until all of the liquid is evaporated, you really don't have a good way of knowing how much product is left in the tank. Most high pressure tanks, you can kind of get a idea based on the total pressure left in the tank. And when the pressure starts dropping in one of these, what we call H cylinders or M50 cylinders, that means there's only about 15% left in the tank. Another issue with this type of tank is residual volume. And so these tanks are grouped in our case, we had 4 tanks to a bank, primary and secondary. So when the manifold saw that the pressure was dropping on the primary side and said, hey, your tanks are empty, switches over to the secondary side and sets off an alarm in the central plant to warn the stationary engineer to go change those tanks out. By weighing those tanks, we realized that 8% of the volume of those tanks was going back to the manufacturer or the supplier. And I confirmed with our supplier that because those tanks are out of their chain of custody, they don't trust that no one has put anything they can't verify in there. All of that gas is evacuated to atmosphere, and then that tank is pulled to a vacuum before new nitrous oxide is introduced, just to make sure that it's absolutely safe. So you can be guaranteed that 8% of the volume of gas that you bring into the facility is going to go to waste. That's the best you can do with a pressurized central nitrous oxide system, if there are no other leaks anywhere in the system. Unfortunately for us, we found that we still had significant losses. I mean, you can see from the graph on the far left that represents our cryogenic liquid waste. We moved to the central compressed gas system, and we still had a small leak of about 650 milliliters a minute. We determined that more accurately than we could with the purchase data by putting the tanks on a veterinary scale that we purchased from Amazon. And that allowed us to take real-time measurements of the weight down to 1/10 of a pound of how much nitrous was leaving the system. You can see how we have many more data points on that trend line for the nitrous waste with compressed gas tanks. And we started considering, okay, where are these losses happening? Next slide, please. And so we began evaluating our delivery system from the manifold to the wall port. And it was a daunting task. St. Vincent Hospital is a 2 million square foot facility with 35 operating rooms and literally thousands of feet of supply line. There's pipe in the delivery system. And we reached out to a vendor who had done a leak assessment at one of our hospitals up in Central Washington. to get a proposal to perform a leak assessment on our system, and the cost was eye-watering. From a purely financial perspective, it would have taken 20+ years of avoiding nitrous oxide leaks at 650 milliliters a minute to offset the cost of that leak assessment with the savings we would see in nitrous oxide, reducing nitrous oxide losses. And just because of the size of the system, we knew it was going to be a very daunting task. Our sister hospital up in Central Washington had basically found during their leak assessment, and that's where these photos on the left-hand side are from, everywhere you could have a leak, they did. They had leaks in their supply system, the supply piping. They had leaks at connections in their manifolds. They had leaks in their zone valves. They had leaks at the alarm panels, and they had leaks at the wall ports. And the issue with a leak assessment is, so you pay a lot of money for a contractor to hand over hand your entire system. And the day they finish, maybe you have a tight system. There's absolutely no guarantee that the next morning you haven't sprung another leak. And leak assessments in and of themselves, as you go through looking for these leaks, the assessment is qualitative, not quantitative. There isn't a tool that finds a leak at a T in your piping system and says this is 0.5 liters per minute. You use generally it's done with a ultrasonic detector that just can hear the minuscule noise of the gas escaping from a tiny crack, and you just say, hey, you've got a leak here. Well, if you have 5,000 of those T's, there's no guarantee that you're going to find them all. It's just an incredibly daunting task to try and get through the system. And so we were really scratching our heads, like, how do we deal with this loss in an economic way? So next slide, please. So Brian?
Sure. So given the complexity of trying to manage leak abatement in a central system like that, we thought, well, is there an alternative so we could avoid doing that? And we turned our attention to assessing the efficiency of what in many hospitals is a redundant secondary supply of nitrous oxide delivered via portable compressed gas cylinders. We call them E-cylinders. They contain about 7 pounds of nitrous oxide. And in many hospitals, they're already there on the back of every anesthesia machine, again, as a backup supply system. These tanks, by and large, are kept closed via the post valve, which you can kind of see in the smaller figures, in the smaller photos there on the right. If a clinician were to want to use this as a supply source, it's as easy as opening that post valve and using the anesthesia machine as normally. Next slide, please. But there are different ways of operating these portable E-cylinders, and we wanted to test, well, is one operating condition more efficient than the other? So in the figure on the left, we just left that post valve open 24/7. Let our anesthesiologist approach the machine, use it as normal. Don't touch the valve. And we measured, again, a similar looking figure, the amount supplied to the system versus the amount delivered via and measured through the electronic medical record. So that figure on the left, you can see there is a small leak, which turns out which we calculated out to be about 6 mLs per minute per machine, as compared to the figure on the right, where we would keep that post valve on the cylinder closed between periods of clinical use. If an anesthesia clinician wanted to use nitrous, he or she would go around, open the tank, use it. When they were done, they would close the tank. And you can see that system is nearly 100% efficient when operated under those conditions. Next slide, please. So we were thinking, great, that's what we should do. But obviously we were concerned about the logistics of managing that type of supply system. And we wondered, well, if we shifted to that, what does that mean in terms of tank exchanges and the frequency at which we're going to need to swap out one of these E-cylinders? So again, we turned to our electronic medical record and used a year's worth of data from St. Vincent, and we looked by clinical location. Well, how much nitrous is being used clinically at each anesthetizing location? So across the x-axis is every operating room at St. V's. The y-axis is the amount in liters of nitrous delivered in 2021, and those dark lines across the center of the figure, those are the volumes at which you would need to exchange a cylinder. So in looking at this figure, in 2021, there are only 4 operating rooms that would even require 1 exchange of the cylinder. And those 2 on the far left, those are pediatric operating rooms. That tends to be where nitrous is used most frequently in the operating room. Even in our busiest pediatric operating rooms, we expected to change a cylinder at most once a quarter. So that logistically, that didn't seem to present a huge challenge, and it encouraged us to proceed. Next slide, please. So we did it, in partnership with Andy and the OR director. We separated all the anesthesia machines from the central supply system, and in favor of using these portable E-cylinders as the primary supply. And when placed side by side with these previous figures that you've seen, when graphed on the same y-axis scale, the figure on the far left, you can't even see the amount of nitrous being consumed in the hospital anymore. We had to blow that figure up into a y scale that's 10x smaller than the other figures, and only then can you see how this is all playing out. Now, instead of having a facility-wide preclinical loss of over 2 liters per minute every minute, now St. Vincent as a facility is losing their preclinical loss is about 3 mLs per minute. So dramatic reduction in loss, a dramatic improvement in overall supply efficiency. Next slide, please. There are other benefits to doing this beyond the environmental emissions reduction benefit. Obviously, as my role as a medical director of environmental stewardship, that's my top priority in projects that I advocate. But we other facets of value to make sure that whatever change we're proposing doesn't undermine the overall value of care that we provide in our hospitals. So on the cost side of the equation, you can see there's an obvious environmental benefit. There's a modest financial benefit. One of the reasons why this problem has not come to light until now is because nitrous is so inexpensive that it never rises up anyone's budget sheet to achieve much scrutiny. But so there's a modest financial benefit. On the quality side, I think there are some important things to mention, notably safety. If you think about the risk of occupational workplace exposure to nitrous oxide, and you combine that concern with a known preclinical loss of over 90%, which was the case for St. Vincent, you have to ask yourself, where is it going in the hospital? Who is being exposed at what threat, and are they exceeding a dangerous threshold? We didn't know if patients were being exposed, visitors, staff. You really have no idea. So the advantage of shifting to a portable supply system is you've confined supply and clinical delivery into the highly controlled work environment of the operating room with air exchange rates that would clear a leak should it occur. And the maximum amount that you would leak in that system is 7 pounds of nitrous, as opposed to a leak from a cryogenic container. You're going to keep leaking those containers until you track down that leak. Obviously, there's the efficiency win. I would argue there's a benefit to overall hospital resilience if you shift to a portable supply system. Instead of relying on a single source in the central medical gas room, now we're using multiple supply systems operating in parallel. If there were a supply disruption to nitrous oxide today, St. Vincent Hospital hasn't, given their current level of clinical use, because you can shift portable tanks around, they have enough nitrous oxide in their hospital today to maintain the current delivery of care for about 10 years. So they're a highly resilient system now. So lots of other benefits to making this transition. Next slide, please. So we've done a reasonable job, I hope, of describing the why you should consider doing this. And we want to take some time to talk a bit about, well, how do you actually do it? And obviously, whenever you're approaching a new initiative, the first thing you need to do is assemble your team. And I would say there are 4 critical team members that you need to engage early in the process. Obviously, you need a champion from the anesthesiology department. You need a champion from the OR directors. You need a facilities champion like Andy, and you need hospital leadership involved to make sure that to have kind of a global set of eyes to ensure that all stakeholders are involved and included. And then we really think about implementation in terms of three phases. There's the assessment phase, which we've described, where you assess the impact, the opportunity, and the potential risk in shifting supply. That kind of brings in the issues of the logistics and the tank exchanges. And is this going to be too overwhelming to manage reliable ongoing supply via these portable cylinders? The second phase is establishing the process and the protocols to support a portable supply system. And then the final phase is actually decommissioning the central system. Next slide. So with respect to assessment, each of those champions has work to do, right? The anesthesiology champion, really look to them to help gather the clinical use data, engaging EMR data analysts, and classifying the nitrous clinical use by location, so you can understand the frequency of tank exchanges, as well as by clinician, so you can better understand the individual practice patterns within your department. It's also good for your anesthesia champion to engage other departments to understand the out of OR uses, indications, and delivery systems in place. The OR director, this is kind of setting up for the next phase, but it's helpful for them to do an inventory of pre-existing nitrous E-cylinders by location. Most of our hospitals have them already, but not all of them do. So in that case, the cost associated with this intervention is potentially retrofitting your anesthesia machines to accept an E-cylinder, and then the cost of renting and bringing those E-cylinders in. That's offset by the cost of renting and bringing in the large H-cylinders, the cryogenic containers. It's also helpful for the OR director to get an inventory of your anesthesia machines, your make models, so you can begin to understand the alarms and the thresholds, so your clinicians understand how the machine is going to respond to a portable supply system of nitrous. The facilities champion also helps gather data, the procurement data from the med gas vendor, itemized by the specific supply tank type. It's also really helpful to do a wall outlet inventory of your central system to make sure that you understand and identify every hospital department that even has the potential to attach to this central system. If you're going to decommission a system like that, you really need to do your homework to understand the true extent of it, so that you're not cutting anybody out at the knees by decommissioning without engaging them first. Once all these data come in, it's helpful to duplicate what we've shown earlier, calculating the clinical based emissions, calculating your preclinical losses as a %. I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about normalizing your utilization. In the event that you cannot get your electronic data, we'll give you some benchmarks and goals normalized by operating room. And then finally, again, getting a kind of a risk assessment of your supply logistics by calculating your anticipated e-cylinder exchange frequency. Next slide. So in terms of assessment, this is more of a reference really that I wanted to include in the slide deck in terms of what data elements are important to request, either from your EMR analyst for the table on the top. If you want to get a true robust set of clinical use of nitrous, these are important data elements to gather. If you have Epic as your EMR, there is a way to go in to Epic directly and harvest a lot of this data yourself. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but I'd be happy to help walk those of you interested in through that process. The medical gas vendor, I would say the most critical pieces to get from them are the number of cylinders per order and the amount of nitrous in pounds per cylinder type. And then it's easy math. You can figure out the total amount procured. The normalization table on the bottom, if you can't get your clinical use data from your electronic medical record, you can get a sense of the severity of your nitrous problem by applying this normalization. We do this routinely for our hospital system in Providence. And you can see if you're emitting more than 50 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per operating room per year, you are in the lowest decile of performance, whereas the goal is to have less than 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent per OR per year. And we know, we've seen people at both ends. St. Vincent is less than 1. It is absolutely doable. We have a lot of we have other hospitals that are kind of have a smattering through those other ranges. But I'd encourage you to do that. If nothing else, this is pretty easy. Just get your procurement data, plug it in here, and it'll give you a sense of the severity. Next slide, please. So the next phase, establish portable supply. And again, in order to do that, based on the assessment from your OR manager, if you need to, you're going to need to retrofit your anesthesia machines and bring in e-cylinders. In terms of the work for the anesthesiology champion, that's really defining and communicating the operating conditions that are so important, keeping that post valve closed between uses, determining what your cylinder exchange trigger is going to be. Are you going to call for a new cylinder when the machine says low pressure, or are you going to drain every cylinder to empty? We have hospitals that have chosen to do both of those strategies. Really understanding what the anesthesia machine is going to do with respect to the alarms. How will it display? What is its threshold? What's the residual volume in the cylinder when the pressure fires? For the GE ISIS machines that we use, for example, we know that little visual alarm will fire when the cylinder has a PSI rating of 381. Oddly enough, I don't know why. At that pressure, there's about 95 liters of nitrous oxide remaining. So that's important information for a clinician to know, so that they know, okay, how urgently or do I need to call for a new cylinder? You still have 95 liters, you have plenty of time. The OR director champion is very helpful in setting up an ordering protocol, figuring out who's responsible for placing the order, what's the PAR level, working with the facilities champion to determine storage, which I'll let Andy talk about in a few seconds. And the OR director is really critical in helping manage and educate the anesthesia technicians around tank exchanges. Where are they stored? How do you transport them safely? How do you exchange them on the machine safely? For us, that's who we rely on to help manage the exchanges, and having the OR director really navigate that protocol with us has been really critical. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Andy so he can talk about storage, because it's a big topic.
So if you do decide to go down this road, you need to consider, are you already storing e-cylinders, nitrous oxide e-cylinders out in the field? You should have established locations where your portable cylinders are stored, and you're allowed per NFPA 99 up to 300 cubic feet per smoke compartment, not stored in a rated enclosure, which equates to around 12 e-cylinders. If you're adding to your total par level of e-cylinders out in the field, you need to evaluate your smoke compartments and make sure that you're not going to be exceeding that number by adding additional cylinders of nitrous oxide. And this isn't just oxidizing gases, it's all compressed gas. You're limited to that 300 cubic feet. So you may have to evaluate whether other par levels are correct if you're going to exceed that 12 tank per smoke compartment limit. And I've had a number of people since we began this work ask me about removing the system. If we decide to do this, don't we have to remove the nitrous oxide system? You don't. You do, however, have to make sure that from a safety perspective, everyone is disabused of the notion that you have nitrous oxide in the wall ports. As you go about planning for the decommissioning process, step one is do a full system inventory. Make sure you know where all of your wall ports are, all of your med gas alarms, all of your zone valves. And you need to determine, because as you bleed the system out, obviously your med gas alarm is going to go off on the nitrous oxide channel. You'll need to figure out how to properly disable and decommission that alarm. And then at each of these locations, place a out of service tag on those sources so that it's obvious to any end user that no nitrous oxide is available at the wall ports. In the case of St. Vincent, in our ORs, which is where we use the majority of the nitrous oxide, it was very simple because all of the ports came from the ceiling. So it was easy to just simply remove the blue hose and put a not in service tag on the port in the ceiling. And then there was no chance of anyone mistaking that nitrous oxide was available. It was kind of an adventure figuring out the right way to disable the nurse call or the med gas alarms. We had a couple of false starts on the very first day and had a few calls to my department asking, why does this alarm keep going off? But I recommend doing some experiments with a system to make sure you have the right plan on the day you decommission so that you don't have a bunch of nuisance alarms. Next slide. So as you can see, we transitioned from equivalent emissions of nearly 600 metric tons of CO2 to only 5.6. And this is entirely doable for any facility, in my opinion. I did see in the poll at the beginning that a number of facilities are using cryogenic nitrous tanks. I would challenge you to go back to your facility, and whether you're on the facility side or the clinical side, gather some data about your actual usage. And if nothing else, get rid of those cryogenic tanks. It just seems that there is no real reason to have those in a facility anymore. Why they were installed at St. Vincent in the first place, that predates my time here. I assume there was an evaluation done, but I think that was just how it was done at the time. And no one had connected the dots and said, are we actually supplying the right amount of, or are we using the right process to supply the right amount of nitrous oxide to the clinician? Next slide. That was the previous slide, sorry. There we go. So we know that nitrous oxide is a significant source of direct healthcare specific greenhouse gas emissions. We have found that throughout our our hospitals, in talking with other health systems, we find the same issue. And as Dr. Cheeseborough mentioned earlier, even the most efficient systems are still leaking a majority of the gas that they purchase. And we have had great success with our conversion to a portable supply. And it really seems to be the ideal approach to eliminating this source of waste. And for me, the takeaway from this whole process, it's really been a eye-opener. I am now approaching every conversation I have with somebody outside of my field as an opportunity to ask a question about how their operation runs. I wonder what other areas of this facility has my department simply been making sure that the lights are on, the gas is flowing, but we've never asked, do you actually need that much gas? Are we wasting other products or other utilities needlessly simply because no one's actually having the conversation outside of their sphere of influence? And so I really encourage everybody to develop interdisciplinary teams, make sure that everybody, all disciplines are represented on your green teams, and have those conversations and look for these unexpected sources of waste that can have tremendous impact with not a lot of work. Next slide.
That's really it.
Yep.
So we just included our email contact if you have questions beyond, but I'll kick it back to John.
Thank you so much, Brian and Andy. That was outstanding. We're going to go to a polling question in a moment. Brian and Andy, I would ask you to look at the Q&A box while we're doing this and see if there's anything that you want to quickly provide an answer to before we move on. Just keep in mind that we're running low on time. So let's see that next polling question. To what extent has your organization considered decommissioning nitrous oxide medical gas systems? Please answer. We'll give it about 10 more seconds. Okay, Hillary, let's go ahead and share the poll. Personally, I'm not surprised to see that this has never been discussed among around 40% of the audience. I'm delighted and surprised to see that discussions have begun, and in some locations, it is in progress. So that's really encouraging. Let's stop sharing and move on with our agenda. Brian and Andy want to answer a question or two in a moment. Taking a moment right now.
Dr. Cheeseborough, do you want to take that first one about education?
Is that in the Q&A section? Is there a framework or step-by-step process ongoing about starting this investigation? Well, that's kind of what we're outlining here, and I think later on you'll hear from Adam and our intention in follow-up to this whole session is to help anyone interested along that step-by-step process. So please reach out.
We will be developing something a bit more formal in writing, we hope, and sharing that in time. In addition, the assessment phase in slide 22 discussed by Brian, I think did a great job of kind of giving the broad outline of what we hope to provide even more detail upon.
Yeah. The next question, are these leaks not detected through the annual TJC required survey? we do find a lot of leaks in, I shouldn't say a lot, we do find leaks in all of our systems during every annual survey. And those are corrected as we repair them. But I would point out that we do find leaks. So we just expect that our systems are going to be lossy to a point. Things like CO2, we go through enough CO2 that converting to a decentralized supply doesn't make any sense. It really has to be supplied through a central system just because of its total volume. And we accept that there are going to be some losses because of that. But for nitrous oxide, because the volume supplied is so minuscule, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to use a central supply. And the survey doesn't cover every portion of the system. And some of this piping, I mean, St. Vincent Hospital was built in 1970, and some of our piping is very old. It's been added to and removed from, and there are potentials for small leaks in the piping system that you would never find without doing a full end-to-end system leak assessment.
Thank you. All right. Let's advance to the next slide, Hillary, because we need to keep moving along in our agenda. It's time for us to hear very quickly from a few case studies of hospitals that are on this journey that has been essentially completed at St. Vincent as described. So next slide, and we'll kick off with Dr. Stuart Brown's presentation. Go ahead, Stu.
Hello, yeah, good afternoon. Thanks very much for the invite to speak at this. I'm thrilled to be part of it. My interest with nitrous oxide waste was sort of piqued by reading about the Nitrous Oxide project in the UK and Dr. Cheeseborough's experience in Washington and Portland. So I thought I'd have a look at what the situation was in the hospital I'm working at in Vancouver General, which is part of Vancouver Coastal Health. Next slide. So I'll really talk about what makes our experience here slightly different, or the points of difference from what Brian's already talked about, and some learning points from our experience. Essentially, part of our assessment, looking at the supply, the procurement, I spoke to the vendors of nitrous oxide here, and they were very helpful. I found that the hospital supply data wasn't great at all. It was quite patchy, but the vendors have been very helpful in collecting data. And it turns out, after speaking to them, that they're actually supplying nitrous oxide at a loss to a lot of hospitals in Canada, where they're obliged to keep within small margins of the contracts they've signed, but because the price of making nitrous oxide has gone up so much, they're actually selling it at a loss. So now's a really good time to get them on board to try and reduce use. They're very motivated to help. The situation at Vancouver General Hospital is that we use 40 to 44 of those large K cylinders every year. They're the 50-pound cylinders, and they contain about 24 kilos of nitrous. And that works out to be about a ton of nitrous per year. And with the global warming potential being 265, that equates to being 265,000 kilos of CO2 equivalent per year. We are probably, for context, we're probably the biggest hospital in BC, but we do not have obstetrics and we don't have pediatric services. Okay, next slide. In part of assessment, that's how I was able to quite accurately say how much we're procuring. We don't use an EMR here where I could easily harvest the data for how much was being used clinically. So we sort of had to think a bit laterally. I've surveyed the department both for how much they use at Vancouver General Hospital and how much we use at our sister site, the University of British Columbia Hospital. This graph on the bottom left there, that's how much was used at Vancouver General. It's very surprising. I felt like it was a complete slam dunk that there was almost no clinical use. I would think there were maybe 2 people that said they used it less than twice a year. So when you compare that to the 500,000 liters that we buy in terms of the gas, it's, you know, we're talking that it's almost all being wasted. Very, very little of it is reaching a patient. In slight contrast, the situation at UBC was that there is some clinical use, so it wasn't quite such a slam dunk. And to objectify that, to put a bit of to put some figures on it, what you can do is ask the biomedical engineers to retrieve data from individual anesthetic machines where it is used, and you get data sets like the one pictured there, and you can scroll through if you've got a bit of time on your hands, and you can see what the gas flow rate was and what the inspired fraction of nitrous was, and you can then come up with some figures for how much was used during an average case, and extrapolate from there. So you can figure out, you can do the assessment of clinical use without EMR. Next slide. So with what we'd learned at Vancouver General, I presented at the department, you know, at the results of our survey and how much we were procuring as a hospital. The anesthetic executive decided that it wasn't actually worth pursuing a lean supply at Vancouver General because we used so little of it. So in that regard, it was quite easy. Our journey went from data gathering actually straight to decommissioning. And what I then did was I spoke to facilities and maintenance and got that outlet inventory. We teed up some time with the executive of the hospital to explain what we were planning and ask for their blessing. And then we were eyeing, there was a bit of time in March where there was going to be some OR downtime during the spring refurb. And we would hope that that we would get in then to reconfigure the machines so to not alarm with low nitrous pressure, and then deal with the alarms on the med gas wall panel alarms in ORs and throughout the hospital to not alarm when there was low pressure. And there's a mistake on my part came here where facilities and maintenance asked me if we should continue buying it. And I said, no, you should stop buying it because we're gonna shut it down. And sure enough, the system depressurized before we were able to deal with those alarms in the scheduled downtime. So there were some overnight annoying nuisance alarms, and there was no way of turning them off actually, other than repressurizing the system. So we had to get 2 cylinders very quickly and repressurize the system. So the lesson learned here would be, don't run out of nitrous before you have dealt with those alarms, because they do frustrate people. Next slide, please. So the impact of just, now that we have dealt with all the alarms and turned off, decommissioned the manifold downstairs, we've saved $6,000 a year because it's such a cheap gas. But that the sort of climate change impact, the CO2 impact of 665,000 kilos of CO2 equates to just below 10% of our OR footprint. Which is not insignificant, and I've taken that from a really detailed analysis done in 2017 by Dr. Andrea McNeil and published in The Lancet. And below, this is a graph that shows hospitals in BC with nitrous oxide manifolds that use more than 5 cylinders a year. And the small red ticker there at the bottom is VGH. You can show that we're certainly not the biggest users, despite being the biggest hospital, albeit without peds and maternity. So I think definitely within BC, there's a lot of work to be done at further reducing waste, because some of these hospitals, when they address their nitrous oxide problem, it will be a much bigger figure than 8% of their OR footprint. That's it from me. I'll now hand over to Dr. Wyndham Strodbeck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. I appreciate the opportunity to present our experience at Virginia Mason in Seattle. I am the chief of anesthesiology there, and I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest with today's discussion. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we are, just for comparison's sake, just sharing our size and scope. We are an independent academic medical center with trainees as well as CRNAs and anesthesiologists. We have a broad variety of facilities, including a number of procedure suites that have centrally piped nitrous, along with a couple of OB/ORs and L&D suites that were recently built in the last 2 years to include nitrous as well. We have 2 outpatient surgery centers, and we had 26,000 general anesthetic cases last year. Next slide, please. Our department's been pretty interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we started our journey in 2015 by reducing desflurane with initially starting through kind of peer pressure and discussions. We then instituted protocols that limited desflurane to certain patient populations. This was effective, as was removing desflurane from the standard anesthesia machine setup, and so you had to ask specifically to have it mounted for a given case, and then it was immediately taken away after that case. And then finally, in 2019, we made the decision to remove desflurane, a decision I know a number on this call have made, and referencing back to the very beginning of today's discussion, the very, very high amount of greenhouse gas emission effect of desflurane made this a fairly easy and straightforward decision. However, next slide, please. John came to me after attending the Project Green Health discussion and said, I think at Virginia Mason we might have an opportunity. Can we figure this out? And at the same time, we were in the process of joining a national health system called Common Spirit Health, which comprises about 150 hospitals across the United States. And in 2022, on Earth Day, our CEO announced a climate action plan that included intention to reach net zero for the entire health system by 2040 and reduce greenhouse gas emission equivalents by 50% by 2030. And at this point, I think John and I knew that we had a significant imperative to begin looking at our work locally as quickly as we could. We'll go to the next slide. And so we gathered data around our greenhouse gas emissions over the last 7 or 8 years. And just in complete concordance with Dr. Cheeseborough's presentation, nitrous oxide is a very substantial component. As you can see, our inhaled gases, sevoflurane at the bottom, being in second place after nitrous, but a very far following footprint. And during this time period, we've actually increased our overall OR general anesthetic volumes by almost 30%. So we have had an uptick in overall cases and case volume while reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, particularly by removing desflurane. But we saw a huge opportunity for nitrous oxide use. Next slide, please. We don't have EPIC. We're unfortunately on Cerner, and so we had to rely on a custom data analytics solution to delve into the depths of our utilization from at the actual point of care, which we were able to do both by provider as well as by location. And we looked at our total purchase volume. So you can see at the top there, this is our 2022 purchase of 6,500 pounds of cryogenic nitrous, along with our total volume of another 600 pounds on top of that. However, our clinical use was only 31,000 liters across all of our care areas, representing 1.9% of the nitrous that we had purchased. So we knew that we had exactly the same problem that had been described by Dr. Cheeseborough. So as a result, going on to the next page, please, we have reached out and begun an aggressive conversation with all of our colleagues around looking at fresh gas flows and looking at nitrous use. On the left-hand slide, you can see that we have instituted some real-time clinical decision support to encourage providers to carefully reduce their fresh gas flows in an effort to not waste anesthetic gases. And we are also now giving providers reports as far as whether they're meeting the MPOG Sustainability 02 standard for greenhouse gas emissions, which is equivalent to 2.83 kilos per hour gas equivalent. And that can be a combination of any of the inhalation agents, whether it's nitrous, isoflurane, sevoflurane in our practice. Over the last 6 months, we've had an improvement from about 83% of those cases now up to 90% of the cases meeting the threshold. This is a report that all providers have on all of their cases. And our average CO2 emissions are down to 2.4 kilograms per hour across our entire case volume. So we, based on this information, we think that we may be getting almost as far as we can with clinical decision support and with trying to encourage people to reduce waste. And really the next step is to decommission our system. And so John and I have just had meetings within the last 2 weeks to begin the process of initiating the decommissioning of our central supply, our cryogenic central supply, and move into a tank-based system. We have had conversations with stakeholders outside of anesthesia, including our obstetric leadership, which is currently relying on labor and delivery nitrous delivered at the bedside via central supply, but there is strong support to move to a tank-based system after this discussion. Because we're talking about anesthetic gases, can we go to the next slide, please? I do want to bring up one more environmental topic, and that is that we were also reviewing our CO2 absorbent selection, and our legacy CO2 absorbent actually developed such a high pH after conversion of the CO2 capture that it required disposal in a corrosive waste special disposal system. We throw away about 2 tons worth of CO2 absorbent each year, costing $9,600 in direct costs to that, and it's trucked to the southern United, or I'm sorry, sent by train to the southern United States, incurring even greater greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have made a switch to an alternative agent and are hoping to see substantial reduction in both cost as well as overall environmental footprint from that change. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present. We'll move on to our next presenter.
So we'll take a quick moment to ask another polling question, and here it is. What concerns or barriers do you see when starting to decommission your nitrous oxide medical gas systems in your organization? We'll give it about 10 more seconds. Very good. All right, let's share the results. Somewhat evenly divided. Clinical concerns, I did not expect to see high in this list, and that could be, if we have time later on, a nice thing to come back to. In the interest of time, we need to keep going, so let's stop sharing and let's advance the slides so that Brian Nelson of Peace Health can begin. Please take it away, Brian.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the opportunity to chat about this here. In the interest of sort of brevity, I can just say, yeah, what Dr. Cheeseborough and Andy said. A little bit more detail here. So just as we walked into this year, this is sort of what we've looked like at Peace Health from an emissions perspective. We began back in 2017. Really, it was through Practice Green Health and Dr. Cheeseborough and Jody Sherman, those kinds of folks who were talking about desflurane. And at the end of 2021, we made the decision to completely remove desflurane from our network here. So as you can see, over the period there of 79% down to 0%, our next opportunity for us was nitrous. So I was very pleased when I went to Clean Med last year and then came away with a, ooh, here's something else we can do now sort of topic. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I did when I got back was just started asking questions, of our facilities folks, and found out where our gas rooms were. And this is sort of an inside the room sort of span here. Good news for us was that we didn't have the most leaky cryogenic canisters that were in there. So that was good news. But over on the right, you can see that we have 2 towers, and in this particular room, there's 24 of those 56 pounders, those 8 cylinders that Andy referred to. Which was hearing Brian talk about that, it was probably one of the more impressive arrays he has seen in any hospital. So not only did we have one room, but then we had a second room with another 11 in there. So that was sort of the initial, where we were starting. And then next slide, please. So it was a pretty simple, just following sort of the same steps that Brian and Andy had walked through for their how-to. So for us, it was just really a question of, how much do we buy and then how much are we using? I did see somebody ask one of the questions around sort of the annual inspections, because that was one of the very first questions that our facilities team had. They said, how can you, because I was relaying the situation at Providence and what they were finding. And our facilities team has this inspected, in accordance with all the rules and regulations, and nothing that would, come anywhere close to, something being that leaky, was possibly sort of even be considered. Same thing on the gas vendor side. When I started asking questions, they said, yeah, that can't possibly be true. That's not, you're not going to find the same thing. So just kind of just accepting those. We just went off and did our analysis just to see what we would run into at the end. So it's really a simple, quite a simple math exercise here for us. So this is what our purchase was for the year. We're of course just looking at those 56 pounders because that's what was going through the walls. So just not including those other items there. And then to be able to compare it to what we were seeing in Epic, we needed to convert that over to gas phase liters. So just simple math right there. So we started off with, each year, or for this representative year, 477,000 gas phase liters is what we were starting with. And then over to the next slide. We were able to use the report out of Epic. You can see what we pulled here from a nitrous usage perspective. We just did a half year here in this case here that we just multiplied by 2. But one thing that we learned in this process too, and it was something that that Brian came across as he was digging into this and sort of developing his playbook on this, was that Epic had an issue at the time when we were doing this analysis and was basically overcounting all of our minutes. It wasn't until actually this last November that Epic fixed that issue, really sort of at from Brian's and his team's analysis, and they were able to identify that to Epic. So I will caution you, if you are now going to go from this meeting and go back and start looking at some of your data, anything prior to that November 22 update that they did is going to be errant and it's going to be over. So because we had this number here of nearly 80,000 gas liters, we went through basically our biggest OR, looked at every single record, looked at what the actual usage was. Long story short, it was about 36% high. So that 80,000 gas phase liters was about 36% high. And then go to the next slide, just doing the simple math based on what we bought, what we were using, we found we were using less than 11% of our supplied gas. The rest of that same story that Providence and others had found, 90% roughly was being wasted and or leaked into the hospital. So very similar, and this was all really quite easy, just because they had already done all the hard work for us. Next slide, please. So we actually next week are kicking off this recommendation here. This is, I won't read all these to you here, but basically we're just starting off with our most nitrous intensive ORs. We are just going to unplug the hoses. We already luckily had the canisters, the e-cylinders in the backs of our anesthesia machines, but they just weren't being used. They were back up like others. So that was already in place. We've already got the gas rooms in our OR pods. So that part was easy as well. So our plan is to really just to unhook those and start to do some education. And then on the next slide, the only thing it does from a, thank you. The only thing really that for us, I mean, this is really quite deceptively easy because we were able to do all the work. The only change here is from a workflow perspective is we're going to have our physicians or our anesthesia providers turn the tank on, the e-cylinder when they get there, and turn it off when they leave. And then as part of room changeover, we'll just have our anesthesia techs sort of double check it to make sure that they're off. But again, very similar to what Brian showed. These are the adjusted numbers for our anesthesia here. Even our busiest room, doesn't require that many changes a year. This is quite easy, and facilities sort of in the end, once we went back to them, they said, yeah, that makes sense. And they were actually honestly happy to not have to deal with the inspections and maintaining that system any longer. So they were on board. So it was really quite easy for us. And we just followed the steps that Brian and team had sort of paved for us. So that's it from a Peace Health perspective. Thank you for letting me talk.
Take it away, Liz.
All right, thanks everyone for staying till the end here. I'm Liz Hansen. I'm an anesthesiologist at Seattle Children's Hospital. And I'm just gonna kind of quickly go through our story here, which I think really starts with Seattle Children's Hospital's commitment, their longstanding commitment to sustainability. We have a really robust sustainability team and have been active as a climate champion for many years. And we actually have already set a quite ambitious goal of providing carbon neutral care by 2025. So this work is really in line with ongoing commitment. Next slide, please. So I first learned about this from our sustainability team that performs an annual inventory of hospital admissions. So in 2018, this was our total hospital admissions for our main campus hospital. And I saw these results at the end of the year. I was surprised to learn that inhaled anesthetics made up 7% of our total hospital admissions, representing our third largest source of emissions. And this is based on purchasing data using Practice Green Health tools. So at this point, our anesthesia group began some initiatives to reduce emissions. The next slide, please. So we started out really with the socialization and education phase, talking about this issue, really learning about it, and a lot of the things that Dr. Cheeseborough already mentioned. So we began with formal presentations to the department, clinical decision support, as others have mentioned. We did have some practice constraints and changes as well. So we also removed our desflurane vaporizers and removed desflurane last year from our formulary as well. We changed our anesthesia machines to have lower fresh gas flow defaults so that we would really prioritize the more efficient use of our anesthesia gases. We have also, because we're a pediatric institution, we do a lot of inhalation inductions. So we move from high fresh gas flow to lower fresh gas flow inductions to reduce waste. And then we really switched our practice over from using nitrous oxide as kind of a routine part of an inhalation induction for almost all of our cases to really saving it just for those indications where, you know, the times where it's really clinically indicated and it's not really possible to provide good care without it. We started also using more total intravenous anesthesia for maintenance. And then I think what's a little bit different about what we've done, we didn't use Epic Slicer Dicer. We actually used a different tool to provide data feedback to our team about the emissions that we were generating through our inhaled anesthetic gases using a software called Adaptix, with direct data feedback monthly to our team on the average emissions for the entire group, and then providing links for people to find their own personal emissions. We also used the Adaptix software to identify higher emissions cases to see where we needed to target our efforts. And then really kind of calling out and celebrating our low emitters and asking them their techniques and tricks and tips for how they were able to do this. And so I'll show the results on the next slide, but this is a QR code because we're spreading this to other pediatric hospitals. And so now we're calling this Project Spruce Forest, and this is a link to our website if you might know anyone who's interested. Go to the next slide, please. So this is a statistical process control chart from the Adaptix software showing our average carbon dioxide equivalents for inhaled anesthetics used in our operating rooms in kilograms per minute. And so where we were starting out, we were emitting about 0.26 kilograms per minute in our prior steady state. And then with all of our interventions over the last 5 years, with the socialization phase, the practice constraints that we added in, and then the data feedback, we are now in a new steady state. We have, you can see multiple instances of special cause variation on this SPC chart, and we have a stable process with our much lower emissions average. And so we've been able to sustain this for about a year now. So going back to our purchasing data on the next slide here over the same time period, if you could advance the slide. So this is the purchasing data and converted over to metric tons of CO2 equivalents from our nitrous oxide, desflurane, isoflurane, and sevoflurane. And you can see that we have decreased it over the years. But remember that my previous slide showed for our operating room emissions, we decreased by 87%. So if you can advance to the next slide, and I think maybe make the animation go, you'll see that comparison. Maybe if you click one more time, yeah, between what we're measuring from our operating room usage to what we're purchasing. And so I was looking at this thinking that maybe other departments were using nitrous oxide, like the emergency department, our dental clinic, our cardiac cath lab for those ablations, the other uses that Dr. Cheeseborough mentioned. So some of that is occurring, but what we learned when I first discovered this and started looking into it, I was able to connect with Dr. Cheeseborough and identify that this is also likely from massive leaks. So connected with our sustainability team and facilities folks to address that. And we have been in the process of decommissioning our central supply for the last about a year. So it's been a little bit of a challenging process for us. And if you go to the next slide, we'll have a little bit of lessons learned from our experience here. I think the most important thing that I can add as a pediatric anesthesiologist to this conversation is that nitrous oxide is really not necessary for pediatric anesthesia care. And we have learned throughout the last few years that kids can do really well with alternatives. We've also learned that central supply decommissioning revealed how even straightforward efforts require really broad support from multiple stakeholders. The infrastructure supporting the environment of care has a number of embedded policies and design standards that are challenged by new best practices. And so we've run into issues there. Decommissioning essential supply takes leadership buy-in, which we have from our hospital, engineering support, which we're also getting, and execution, which has been ongoing. And like any project that could involve presenting to regulators and pulling a permit, we have found there are some unexpected requirements of time and effort. So that's why this process has been taking longer than we had hoped, but it is worth it for the future of medicine, healthcare, and our children. And I have some names of folks who've been involved in this project with me at Seattle Children's. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks to all of our presenters. We're going to quickly hop over to Adam Lowe, who has been a wonderful partner in thinking about how we can add to the duration and depth of this project and vision of transforming nitrous oxide delivery throughout the region. So Adam, would you take the time now to describe what we've been discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for hanging on. I will try to make this brief. So I am a MHA student at the University of Washington in the School of Public Health. Part of my project that I am working with this group on is to collect current data on nitrous oxide use within the healthcare industry. And hopefully after this webinar, many of you feel energized to reduce the amount we're wasting and change your delivery method. And so if you are interested in collaborating with myself and this group, being a part of those efforts, a few of the things we can offer is to normalize and analyze the data that you send to us, scheduling periodic check-ins, so kind of a project management light sort of approach, sharing a in the works nitrous oxide medical gas decommissioning playbook that the experts on this call are helping to put together. And then finally, if you need time with any of those individuals who you feel we would benefit from based on current barriers you're experiencing, we can set that up as well. So Hillary, if you could advance to the next slide. Oh, also a poll. So I guess we'll do the poll very briefly. So this is: what resources or support do you feel would be most helpful to drive the decommissioning of nitrous oxide medical gas systems in your organization? So I will let you answer that. However, while you do, there's a QR code up on the screen. So if you have a smartphone handy, go ahead and scan that QR code. It will take you to a very short survey where you can let us know if you're interested in collaborating. It also is helpful for us if you are here planning to get any sort of continuing medical education credits. Completing this survey is helpful for us so we can document that you've made it to the webinar and that you've answered those exact questions. And if you do not have a smartphone handy, when you close out the Zoom, you will also be diverted over to that survey online. So those are your two options for completing the survey. Since we're 4 minutes now, I will close out, and I think we can turn it over to our final Q&A session if there is time and some discussion.
I think in the interest of staying, not too late, we will advance the slides, and it already has been. Thank you, Hillary, to some final thoughts. And these are mine. To achieve our vision that I described at the outset of this webinar of transforming the delivery method in hospitals and ASCs across the region, we're going to share this recording with you, and in turn, we'd love for you to share it with others, especially your other organization counterparts. And then please consider participating in the process that Adam just laid out. It will help you, it will help us with measuring the impact that we hope to have across the region. Next slide. A final thank you to all of you who have stuck with us for these last 90 minutes and listened in. I hope it has been for you as inspirational as it was when I first heard Dr. Cheeseborough and Andy's CleanMed presentation. It inspired me to want to make it happen at my facility. I hope it has done the same for you. I just wanted to thank everybody who participated in the planning process for this webinar. It's been an awesome team to work with. For those of you who do wish to stay on and offer some questions, feel free to do so. Presenters, I understand that you may have some other commitments to move on to, but since we had hoped for a true discussion when we designed this, it seems only appropriate to provide a final few minutes for doing so. So let's conclude the slide sharing and open it up to some Q&A for those who want to stick with us. We've had a few, actually several questions answered within the chat function. And thanks to especially Brian Cheeseborough for tackling some of those throughout the course of this webinar. I think given where we're at with participant number going down, if folks do want to unmute and engage in conversation with any of us in the planning team, feel free to go for it or raise a hand. I will address a question to especially Andy and Brian Cheeseborough, and that is, as you talk within Providence about your experience at St. Vincent, are you encountering, I guess, trepidation with the notion of decommissioning what has been bought and paid for and set up as a system of central supply?
I wouldn't say trepidation. I mean, I think culturally, Providence is pretty aligned, is aligned with our goal in the environmental stewardship program to become carbon negative. And this is such an opportunity to advance toward that we have a lot of engagement when we present the topic. I would say, and I wrote this in the chat, I think there's pretty consistent surprise and some skepticism amongst our facilities colleagues that this is real. I mean, it's so unheard of to them that a system could be this inefficient. That's probably where we spend most of our time is working through the data with them and convincing them that it's real. And the work of St. Vincent, having gone through the whole thing and done the analysis and made the projections, and then see that reality follows our analysis, inspires confidence in the rest of our colleagues in Providence. And it's not just St. V's that has done this. There's now 7 hospitals in Providence that have decommissioned. Prof Portland, where I work, just decommissioned today. So it's kind of snowballing, and we look forward to supporting the rest of the system and the rest of you on the same course of action.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Danette, you have your hand raised. Do you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Actually, I guess I wanted to make a comment. So one of the things, I work at Sunnybrook Health Sciences in Toronto, and we've added this to our quality improvement plan for our upcoming year to reduce nitrous oxide waste. And I will say one of the things that we've had to be very careful about is fighting and addressing miscommunication, because the first thing everybody hears is that the director of pharmacy wants to turn off the nitrous oxide and then we won't have any anymore. And we've had to put a fair bit of effort into saying, no, we just want to get rid of the waste. And that has been, and I don't know if others have had that experience, or maybe in early days they did, but we did find that to be an initial challenge.
I think that's pretty consistent. I think when even in our institution, people think, oh, you're taking it away, and we're not taking it away. We're changing the supply to make the supply system efficient. We're not eliminating it. It does have a use. Nitrous is a unique medication in our arsenal for patient care. And when used judiciously and appropriately and efficiently, there's not a need to eliminate it. And I agree. We've encountered the same thing.
I will say that this work doesn't necessarily stop the day you close the source valve. It's been in just the last couple of months. As Dr. Cheeseborough mentioned, we decommissioned St. Vincent Hospital 16 months ago. And yet in the last couple of months, I happened on a conversation of, well, because we don't have nitrous at St. Vincent anymore. And so there's still like this rumor in the background that no, St. Vincent doesn't have any nitrous. And so, yeah, you have to continue to educate people as they come from other facilities, because obviously, a lot of people move facility to facility, and there's a lot of churn in the healthcare employment, and this isn't normal. And so they're coming into a system and seeing, oh, the nitrous wall ports all say not in use. They must not have nitrous. They don't have this history of knowing that we have decommissioned the system and there's an alternate supply.
Another question has come through on the chat that raises the issue of permitting. And I'm not sure we've spent much time on that. Seattle Children's mentioned the need for a permit. The question was about why would you need permitting? Hoping that somebody can address the issue of kind of the regulatory approval side of the decommissioning process.
So as the Seattle Children's person, I will try to answer that. I'm, the clinical side of this, so I'm not as deeply involved in all of the decisions with facilities and with our executive leadership team. I think that part of the issue is that we were also opening up a new building, and so I think it's just been slightly complicated with making sure that we are following all of the rules, following our own policies. So that's part of what's had to be updated, is just making sure that we have systems and plans in place for this changeover from essential supply to the tanks. And so that has been a challenge. And unfortunately, my collaborators on this project that have been working on that side are, I don't think, on the call today to answer those questions, but I would also welcome others from the webinar to jump in if you have any comments as well.
Jeff Glass, do you care to comment?
Sure, I'm happy. This is Jeff Glass from Providence, and I've been working this issue a little bit in Washington State with the head of construction review, Department of Health, and I did notice that Susan Upton was on the line, and I think another colleague from Oregon was on the line. But the Department of Health's position is that they would view this as a change of what they call a change of use. In other words, even though it's a functional operational change of use and doesn't require new construction, they would expect a document that would do what they call a risk assessment of changing the use. And essentially, it's documenting everything that all the presenters have talked about in terms of their clinical protocols, logistic protocols, and especially leadership support into literally a 1 or 2 page document that could be submitted to the Department of Health for their approval. And with that, we would have had then met those permitting requirements from their perspective to go ahead and do that. So we've talked about that becoming part of a playbook, possibly. Washington and Oregon tell me, at least the Washington head told me that they're in communications with Oregon about taking a similar perspective to this, and the Joint Commission publishes a fairly simple nomograph about doing a risk assessment that seems like a good basis for documenting that. Getting that approval should be fairly straightforward. That's a process that's existed in Washington for several years. So I think this is fairly new to them too. So that's a little bit maybe a part of the challenge, but I don't think it has to be that difficult or that that time consuming. I think that helps.
Thank you. As I imagine myself in the role of an audience member here, just learning about this and wanting to act upon it, and feeling concerned about how to go about this process without being seen as alarming, I guess. I'd like to hear from anybody in the audience, especially people in the roles of facility manager or perioperative services manager, that finds this work inspiring but has concerns about, I guess, gaining enough companionship in wanting to lead the effort within your specific facility, and what concerns, where you see your barriers as being.
This is Stephanie. Hi, didn't know if you saw me. I'm the director here at St. Anne Hospital in Burien, Washington. I think making sure that we partner with facilities is going to be a barrier, but I think that we can get there. I'm very excited about this, John. As you know, I'm always trying to find ways that we can be more green. And I don't sound like it because I'm from Texas, but I've been living up here in the Pacific Northwest now for about 10 years. So I want to do all that we can. And I agree, we've done a lot, but we've got a long way to go to make sure that we get to those 2030, 2050 marks that Common Spirits put out for us, as well as just our own kids and then future grandchildren. So my main focus is making sure that our facilities departments get on board with us and understand what we're trying to do. I've been stealing screenshots from you, but I'll also get the PowerPoint so that I can present it. And I do have a really incredible surgeon that is very supportive of this, on top of anesthesia, which sometimes you can get anesthesia to buy in, but you might get some surgeon pushback. And so I'm very thankful that I have a surgeon champion for this. So I'm excited to see where we can go. And, you know, I always like to go first. So get ready. I'll be calling you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank
Do we
you.
have any facility managers in the audience left who here to talk about whether they feel like they'll be in the hot seat having concerns about it approaching anesthesiology?
This is Kelly from Victoria General Hospital. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, so when this opportunity came up through Lindy, I went to our OR manager, who immediately incorporated the services of one of his anesthesiologists. And also our sustainability department all took a direct interest as soon as I mentioned this, because, well, we've been told repeatedly that our relatively small hospital consumes far more nitrous than would be indicated by the size and the programs we run. So there's a budgetary appetite for it. There's a greenhouse gas appetite for it. Our system is aging, so I'm very happy to take steps. So I think I'm going to have multi-department support when I take the recording from this and move it forward.
Go ahead, David.
This is Steph. I'll just couple the fact that we're actually about to remodel our operating rooms. And one of the things we're looking at is all of our old anesthesia booms that, for those of you who provide anesthesia, it's almost on top of your head. And so we want to get rid of that and bring our drops from the ceiling. And so I love the fact that someone said that they remove those drops. We just won't install them to begin with. And that will be our conversion point, because if it's not there to begin with, when we come back online, it's just like, sorry, we're now on tanks, and we move forward from there. So use it as a weapon instead of getting beaten by it.
Now, you bring up a really good point, Stephanie, and that's in terms of the financial implications of this work. You'll save a modest amount of money through the avoidance of purchasing nitrous oxide. Where you will really save a lot of money for your health system is in new design and construction. Avoiding the design and construction of these complicated compressed gas pipeline systems will save significant dollars. UCSF is building a new, huge, enormous quaternary medical center in San Francisco, and which is due to open in about 10 years, but they've already decided to avoid putting in a central piped nitrous system, and they're saving 6 figures of dollars saved by doing that. So that's where the real financial benefit lies.
Hi, this is Kenyon Anderson from Trainer HL. We're an architecture firm specializing in healthcare, and one of the things that I thought was interesting is in line with that, don't plan it in up front so you don't have to go to the state and then decommission it. The other part is I think there's a lot of maintenance that comes along with every medical gas system, and I don't know what those costs would be on the facility planning side. I'm assuming they're fairly high. But I think there are savings there also that you can look at.
Yeah, there's also a safety perspective. None of those cylinders are light. Cryo cylinders weigh upwards of 600 pounds when they're full. H cylinders weigh 100 plus, and they all have to be manually manipulated into and out of their bays. And every time you touch one of those tanks, we have protocols for proper handling, but there's always the chance of an accident. And by eliminating one manifold in your tank room, that's just one more potential accident eliminated.
What's the learning curve for the staff in the ORs to using the tanks as opposed to central system? Because I think from an engineering standpoint, it sounds like a great thing to move everything to tanks. But I'm just wondering from the clinical side, how long did it take your teams to get used to turning tanks on and off at the anesthesia machine as opposed to tying in hoses to their central system?
It's pretty straightforward. You know, the machine interface itself on the patient side of the machine, there's really no difference. The main behavior that we're asking our clinicians to do is to walk around the back of the machine and turn that wrench about 3 turns, and then that's it. If they remember to turn it off at the end, that's helpful. Our process is to have the anesthesia techs come and do it, because at the end of the case, we're trying to guide a patient through emergence and prepare them to transport to the recovery room. So we're not putting that responsibility back onto the clinicians, which I think is a reasonable course of action. But I would say the bar for educating clinicians to do this is very low also. And also it's about educating them to the alarms. We are very tuned into an alarming anesthesia machine, and it gets our own heart rate going. So knowing what the machine is going to do before you experience it is also pretty helpful.
In the process to swap out a tank in the middle of a procedure, or is that ever a concern?
No, so in the operating room, nitrous is an adjunct to general anesthesia. It's never the sole. You're never putting all your clinical trust in the administration of nitrous. So it's, in my opinion, it's not a critical life-saving medical gas. I've never saved someone's life with nitrous oxide. So in that sense, you can do a tank exchange without jeopardizing your clinical management. It takes to swap out a tank, it takes about 30 seconds. And so you're not introducing risk, even in swapping on the fly.
And one last question, you mentioned when they take empty H cylinders back, there's about 8% that's left in the tank that have to evacuate to the atmosphere. How about for E cylinders, or is that a concern for E cylinders?
It is, but we don't know we didn't quantify the exact volume. The manifolds switch over at a non-zero pressure. And so if you can imagine, they switch at 100 PSI. There's 100 PSI of nitrous in that giant H cylinder. That's a significant volume.
Thank you.
One final question from me. Will technicians, anesthesia technicians, see this as reducing their work burden? Will they enjoy this if their respective facilities can pull this off? Randy Johnson, what do you think? If you're with us, or any other technicians? Brian Cheesebro, how would you answer my question?
Sorry, swapping out my dying earpiece. So this was a question related to the engagement of anesthesia techs in general.
Yes, will they see this as a positive thing, a reduction in the workload?
It's not really a reduction in the anesthesia tech's workload, but because this isn't something that they do normally. But it is not a significant increase to their workload either. That's why I think it's really important also to do that location-based tank frequency analysis so that you can reassure your anesthesia techs, look, we're not going to be calling you multiple times per day to come swap out these tanks. We might call you once a quarter to come swap out a tank. And in that way, they know they're not going to be overwhelmed, but they do have an active and critical role in the function of a system that has all these other benefits. So in that sense, they're engaged by the work and not overwhelmed by the logistical ask.
Well, we've gone over by about half an hour. It seems like an appropriate time for us to conclude. I will just remind folks to feel free to give us not only your opinions about how we did today, but also let us know what kind of support you're looking for. Tell us what level of interest you have in receiving our offer of ongoing support. With that, I will just say thank you again to everybody for sticking through a 2-hour webinar on a somewhat technical topic for some of us. I hope you found it inspiring, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.